Hello, welcome to Zionism Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond, Expanding the Conversation. This is our fourth session, and today we're actually going into the convening that this whole series has been based on. We started doing this series based on a convening that we had at JTS in October, and each of the sessions pulls from some of the themes that we discussed. And today I'm really delighted that my colleague, Rabbi Gordon Tucker, is going to share his kind of salient points from the convening itself. He'll give both a sense of the convening and the genesis of this idea and project and where it was coming from. So the entire series has been dedicated to having JTS faculty share their thoughts on contemporary Zionism and the context that shapes current debates. And today we're going to hear about those debates and how they were impacted, how they were presented at our convening itself. It's my great pleasure to welcome Rabbi Gordon Tucker, and I will introduce him in a second. But first, I want to thank our generous sponsor, Mr. Jan and Dr. Joan Popkin, who are sponsoring at the Navi level. Sponsorship of this series is an excellent opportunity to honor someone, to promote JTS learning, and there are 3 sponsorship levels that you can have. My colleague Tani Schwartz-Herman is going to post a link in the chat on how you can learn more. And while there are 2 sessions left in this series, there's a lot more to sponsor at JTS, so we appreciate your giving at any time. And thank you, the many of you who already have supported this series by donating. We really appreciate it. You will be able to find recordings of this and all of the previous sessions on the webpage for this series. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Rabbi Gordon Tucker. As Vice Chancellor for Religious Life and Engagement, Rabbi Gordon Tucker has focused on enhancing Jewish life at JTS. Rabbi Tucker's current role brings him back to JTS, where he served as the Dean of the Rabbinical School from 1984 to 1992. He was also an assistant professor of Jewish thought from 1979 to 1994. He also served as the senior rabbi at one of North America's foremost conservative congregations, Temporal Israel Center in White Plains, in kind of the break there. And we are so very happy to have him here today to present this initiative, which has really been a new tentpole for JTS. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gordon.
All right, thank you very much, Ellie, and a good day to all. I thank you for joining this webinar on the first day of the new month of Kislev. As you've heard, I don't need to introduce myself. I've had that kind introduction from Ellie Gettinger. I do feel the need just for a moment to acknowledge the grief and outrage that we feel today at the news that Omer Nutra of blessed memory was in fact killed 14 months ago on October 7th, 2023. And as if that were not horrible enough, the fact that his body is being held still in Gaza, even at this time, is just unfathomable cruelty. We can only pray that justice will find the perpetrators of these crimes, and that some measure of comfort will eventually come to his family and to his big circle of friends, many of whom are here at JTS, who knew him and loved him. Yehi zichro baruch. So to the agenda at hand, I certainly welcome this opportunity to reflect on the very recent convening held at JTS on the subject of Zionism, today, tomorrow, and beyond. A bit of history. JTS has a very proud history of bringing together experts in many fields to treat important topics for both the Jewish world and the wider world of which Jews are a part. This history goes back nearly a century now, with the creation in 1938 of the Institute for Religious and Social Studies, which has furthered interfaith work to this very day. There was also the Conference on Science, Philosophy, and Religion, which ran from 1939 to 1968. Even, by the way, a little bit of trivia, one of its volumes garnered a footnote in Brown versus Board of Ed. There was a major conference on law as a moral force, which featured the then U.S. Chief Justice. That was in 1957. A National Endowment for the Humanities Institute on Teaching the Ancient World over 2 full summers in the 1970s. Made a very significant impact on education in American universities. Various other conferences over the years. I'm just giving you a little piece of that, including recent ones, very recent ones on civic friendship and on virtue ethics. It was part of a recently adopted strategic plan for JTS to embrace as fully as possible this institutional heritage and to make JTS more than ever a place where crucial dialogue happens on a high level by acknowledged experts in the field, leading to new insights that can affect policy. So convenings on matters of critical significance and interest to the widest Jewish audience and to the general public as well are an essential part of this vision. So last April, we held such a gathering on the very timely subject of anti-Semitism and allyship. And the most recent one, which is the one we are focusing on in this webinar, was held just 5 weeks ago at the end of October. And the title, again, as mentioned before, was Zionism, Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond. So I want to say a few words about what motivated this particular focus on Zionism just now. So one thing that is obvious is that recent developments in North America, not just in North America, but even more so in other parts of the world outside of Israel, those developments have too often made Zionism and Zionists into targets of protest and even ostracization. And this, of course, has only increased in frequency and intensity since the October 7th attacks and the ensuing war. But there's an even deeper motivation than this obvious surface one, which is, I don't mean by calling it surface to suggest it's superficial, it's important and weighty, but there's a deeper motivation that's more internal to the Jewish world rather than reacting to things coming from outside. And I want to briefly sketch out that motivation that has to do with things internal to our community. There was a young member of Knesset at the time, some of you may remember her, Stav Shafir. About a decade or so ago, she spoke to her colleagues in the Knesset of her vision of a Zionist politics that, and these are her words, that wants to make peace, that wants to improve relations between the different sectors of Israeli society, that believes in equal rights, in budgetary equity, and that thinks that every single Israeli citizen, irrespective of national, religious, ethnic origin, deserves an equal portion. That, in her view, was what she called the true Zionism. Well, that's the vision of Zionism that I believe most American Jews, and especially the youngest of them, also wish to relate to. I was born in 1951. And because of that accident of birth, when I was born and when I grew up, I and my cohort, my age cohort, have known more or less the kind of Zionism of which that member of Knesset spoke. Now, today, and for some time, there are much deeper divisions in what Zionism means and aspires to, that's within Israel. And crucially, those rifts affect American Jews and the ways in which they see Israel and Zionism and think about their relationship to it. They engender a quest for understanding that can lead to renewal, because mostly, I think, so many Jews like myself are concerned about our children who grew up hearing about the wonders of Israel from their parents, and in many cases have at least a general emotional connection to the land, to the state, and to the people. There are, the vibes are there, but they feel a kind of bewilderment and loss, often enough alienation, that comes from not having seen and experienced what their elders did. Often they see the contrary when they consider some of Israel's policies and actions that they see only in isolation from a much larger context. Many of them ask themselves, when am I going to feel the thrill of a wondrous Israel? So part of the impetus for this convening, and one that is yet to come, we'll say a word about that at the end. Part of the impetus was the conviction that we mustn't write off those young American Jews who struggle to find their place in the story of Zionism and Israel, because their discomfort is, and it's always the case with discomfort, it's a sign of profound caring. So that was the reason that we decided to bring together scholars, journalists, educators, religious and communal leaders, all to share research and to present views, to be in dialogue on a range of matters affecting Israel and the diaspora and the relationship between them. It's worth saying a couple of words about Israel and the diaspora. The distinctive dynamic between Israel and the diaspora is an age-old dynamic, because it goes back to the very beginning of Jewish settlements outside the land of Israel, that is, settlements outside Israel that survived and were stable. We're not talking about the 10 lost tribes of the 8th century BCE, but the settlements of Jews that commence as far back as the first Babylonian exile in 597 BCE. From that time onward, beginning with those exilic communities in Babylonia, there have been Jewish communities throughout a diaspora, many of which flourished, were fruitful in all sorts of ways. Others didn't do quite as well, but there have always been these multiple centers of Jewish life, each with their own characteristics, each with their own cultures and customs, and eventually their own literatures. After all, there's not just a Palestinian Talmud, there's a Babylonian Talmud. And those literatures are both sacred and secular. The relationships between the communities in the land of Israel and the diaspora have historically been complicated. They're not just complicated today. When you see complications today, it's a good bet that they've been around for a long time. And the complications come from the prominence of each being endlessly debated, and the fortunes of each of them oscillating back and forth over the centuries. Today, both the Israeli and the North American Jewish communities, they both have considerable strengths, though in somewhat different ways. They're both sizable in terms of the number of Jews. They are both important centers of Jewish learning and culture. And I want to note, and maybe for some of you, it's to remind you that The late Professor Simon Ravidovich of Brandeis University, he famously analogized the land of Israel and the diaspora to two foci of an ellipse. You may have to reach back and remember something about high school geometry here. He loved these analogies like this. Israel and the diaspora, two foci of an ellipse, meaning neither has predominance over the other. And what's more, the sum of whose distance from every point in the Jewish landscape is a never-changing constant. That is, for him, what the geometry told him in this analogy was that every Jew is nurtured equally from the combined work of Israel and the diaspora, both of them working together. So needless to say, not everyone accepted that analogy. Ben-Gurion most notably rejected out of hand this idea that there was a parity and an inequality between Israel and the diaspora. And moreover, and this has to be noted, that ever since 1948, and the reality of a sovereign Jewish state in Israel, there have naturally been from time to time differences of opinion among Israeli and diaspora Jews about policies of the state of Israel. Right? Now, since there is sovereignty and since there is state power, the ante is upped very significantly. And so all of these debates remain alive today. And because of that, holding a convening about Zionism in what is a preeminent diaspora center of Jewish learning and scholarship like JTS necessarily had this dynamic always in the background. And indeed, the main intent in this convening was to focus on the effects of Zionism in theory and Zionism as it lives out in Israel, the effect that has and the influence that has and the ways in which it challenges the diaspora. So having said all of this by way of introduction, let me now highlight for you just a few of the many important moments that happened in this two-day event. The very first session in the convening featured American Jewish historians, Professors Jonathan Sarna of Brandeis and Jack Wertheimer of JTS, as well as another American Jewish historian who is JTS Chancellor Shuli Rubin Schwartz. Professor Sarna began his remarks in an unusual way. He reminded us that Jewish history doesn't only proceed on the intellectual and ideological plane. It also, from time to time, and maybe more than from time to time, is crucially dependent on some very practical factors. And not essential factors, but accidental factors. Accidental in the sense that they didn't have to happen at that moment in history, but they did. So he suggested that the following fact about the early history of Zionism would likely surprise people. And these were his words. I'm quoting him now. Just as today, the digital revolution lies behind so many developments, so the great industrial revolution, and specifically steam travel, made Zionism possible. Had there not been steam, there never would have been Zionism, because suddenly going back to Zion was practical. I don't have to wait for eagle's wings and clouds to take me there. Right? For much of the history of the diaspora, people dreamed about Israel, but they thought about the day would come when the eagle's wings would bring us there. Now the steam engine could bring you there, and it became much more practical, and Zionism entered the stage of history. And so Sarna's and Wertheimer's presentations filled out much of the relevant history. But it was the very personal reminiscence of Chancellor Schwartz's presentation in that opening session that did two things. First, it underscored the role that Hebrew language played in Zionist history. And we will come back to that. We will revisit that a little bit later in this webinar, the important role of Hebrew language. And the second thing it did was it shone a spotlight on the separate pulls that were exerted on Jews by Israel, and in this case, the American diaspora. Those pulls were separate, they were real, they were very different. And she illustrated this by speaking about her own great-grandfather. She noted that his home was reputed to be the only Hebrew-speaking home in his shtetl in Western Ukraine. That was the language of the home. When threatening circumstances moved him to have to leave his home and ultimately to travel to, of all places, Denver, Colorado. Why? Because siblings of his had settled there and they had the resources to support his family's emigration. Well, what was going through his mind? What was going through his heart as he was making that journey? Well, he left a diary, and she read some of it. So here is the first of several clips that I'm going to show you that this comes from her talk, a little less than 2 minutes, and you'll see exactly what she is describing here, both in terms of the love of Hebrew and the very uneasy relationship between Israel and diaspora. Please take a look.
Of the family. I want to share a few excerpts from his diary, which he wrote while he was on the train to Warsaw, en route to the United States, but there were a lot of other people on the train who were en route to Palestine. His words, which he later translated, give us an understanding of how he understood his Zionist commitments. He wrote, "I dreamt sometimes of leaving this country, but for the sake of an entirely different country, of that country to which I am bound historically, love for which I had sucked in with my mother's milk, for the restoration of which I have worked all my life. I dreamt of leaving this country for the sake of that country, which although I was never there, every corner of it is well known to me and loved by me. Each name, as of those places that are mentioned in the Bible, so of the new colonies there, sounds so sweet in my ears. Hebron, Yerushalayim, Beit Lechem, Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion, Merchavia. How beautiful, how charming are these names. There, to Palestine, had my heart always attracted me. And suddenly, America? What does the name say to my soul? What relation to me has Denver, Colorado, where I am going?" You can feel that his Zionism was.
So obviously, she went on from there. We can't show all of it. We're giving you little tastes with a few of these clips, and I want to remind you that the recordings of all of these sessions are available on the JTS website. I think we're going to have, or already may have, in the chat, the ways to get there. And I will remind you of that more than once. But it's worth noting that it's not exactly an irony, but that diary entry has a certain wistfulness to it. But that wistfulness, we have to understand, is coexisting alongside another undeniable fact, which is that his family, coming from that travel and settlement in the diaspora, proceeded not only to flourish, but to become important Jewish leaders in the diaspora, even as the eye on Zion remained wide open. So to me, I think that the reality of who is telling that story and the wistfulness that she is bringing to us, and the fact that it is coming from someone who has who represents the very strong and sustaining Jewish leadership in the diaspora, says an enormous amount about the specialness of this relationship of these two foci. So I think we'd like to just take a few moments in the midst of this webinar to see if there are some questions that may have come up, and I'll turn to my colleague Ellie to send one or two of them now before we proceed.
Well, I don't have anything in the chat yet, but I'm sure we'll get some. I kind of, for my sake, I'm wondering, and actually, you know, you had this immense challenge, Gordon, and your team had this immense challenge of saying, we're going to do a workshop, we're going to do a 2-day convening on Zionism and the diaspora. And, you know, as you know, that could be everything, or you could narrow to like such. How did you decide, and especially in a realm in which context is so important, how did you balance out kind of historical and future facing pieces, and what were your kind of guiding principles in terms of developing a schedule that would provide both enough context without being all context?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was clear, given the nature of JTS and its own history, where virtually every chancellor of this institution has been a historian of one way or another, that it was going to have to begin with putting down some historical markers and getting us to understand what the roots of all of this is. But as for the rest of it, it was really a process of trying to latch on to the, you know, where all the itches are. what is itching Jews today, and particularly Jews of the diaspora, the North American diaspora, which we tried to really focus on. And we're going to, as I proceed, you will hear some of that. The matters that have to do with religion and state, matters that have to do with pluralism, which is possible to be a Jewish and democratic at the same time. It's very easy to say, it's a little harder to do. What are the ethics of state power and how they is wielded, and how in the world should we be educating young Jews about Israel and Zionism today? These all came in because we thought these are all matters of current vexation, and sometimes vexation, sometimes just misunderstanding, and a need for clarification. In the case of education, of course, a very big dose of where do we go from here and how are we going to fashion our future as diaspora Jews who are comfortable with and even proud to call ourselves part of the Zionist story.
Well, and I'm sure we'll get more questions later, but let's keep moving, and then we'll hold questions. We'll have.
And if a number of questions start piling up in the chat, and you think there's a moment that ripe for stopping for a moment, I'll trust you to do that.
Okay, thank you.
The convening after that first session then jumped right into one of the very current matters that tend to create serious misgivings and misunderstandings between Israel and the diaspora. And that is what I've mentioned now, the uses of the state power that is, of course, an entirely new phenomenon for the Jewish world in the 76 years since 1948. By the way, I should note very carefully, I am not suggesting, of course, that there aren't misgivings and sharp debates about such things within Israel itself. There certainly are. But that was not our primary focus. It's what it does about the dynamic between Israel and the diaspora. There's there's a whole history of Jewish thought. It comes out very prominently in Yehuda Halevi, but not only there, that Jews, without power, could talk a very high rhetoric of morality. But when you are actually responsible for a state and the safety of its citizens, and you have the military might and other means to bring that about, suddenly there are vexing questions Jews didn't have to deal with for nearly 2,000 years, or actually more than 2,000 years. So what did we do? These wedge issues, if I can call them that, have also been made a lot more provocative and a lot more intense by the military operations and the combating of terrorism in Gaza and elsewhere. And so understanding that there were in this area, both on the one hand, excruciatingly difficult matters in the ethics of warfare, and also issues that touch on the reporting on the war in the Jewish press in America. So we brought together one of the premier philosophers and ethicists in Israel, Professor Moshe Halbertal, and the editor-in-chief of the Forward, Jody Ruderin, who had also been the Jerusalem bureau chief of the New York Times for several years. So the session produced some very insightful exchanges on both the substance of the moral questions and the ways in which they can be explicated to a public anxious for an understanding that would allow it to develop informed opinions on this vital and fraught subject. One of the important moments, I would say, in the entire convening came when Dr. Halbertal set forth both two things. So both a crucial argument for understanding the agonizing nature of the military decisions that are forced upon the actors in real time, right? Getting people who normally are not faced with this to understand what those agonizing real-time decision trees are. And at the same time, he made an equally powerful plea that we mustn't resign ourselves to a kind of an anything goes attitude, even when security is at stake. There is still a place for moral judgment. So I'm going to show you now a second clip. It's another short clip from Halbertal's talk. It was in response to a question from the audience. The question was regarding a statement that he had made to the effect that moral standards should not be an obstacle to defeating the enemy, but that the risk is becoming like the enemy. So the questioner was asking for some elaboration, and was also asking him for an assessment of how easy is it to make such arguments with the public, and the Israeli public in particular. So here is the clip I have in mind. It's a little less than 3 minutes long.
No, you should.
Can you make this argument in the current atmosphere of Israel that
the moral defeat is worse than anything else?
I would say no. I mean, you have to say morality of war should not tie your hand to win the war. Let's start with that. If it does, that's something wrong with your morality. It has to enable you to protect yourself. But if you think, I would say two things about that. If you think that what failed you is actually you being moral, your understanding of your failure is very shallow. My experience is many times there is a deep connection between incompetence and brutalization. Okay? It's like a very bad interrogator, police interrogator, who says, The problem of me drawing the information is they don't allow me to torture this guy. No, no, no. You have enough means and enough, something about your intelligence as a competent interrogator is a problem here. That's the first thing. But in a deeper way, you ask yourself, what's then the point of victory if it engages undermining whom you are? What's there the point? Actually, the moral outrage we feel towards the other side, in many ways, has to do with its brutality, with its annihilation fantasies, with its indiscriminate, with its terror, etc., etc. Now, there is a power to the appeal that says, is that what you want to be? Right? Well, you say that there is no innocent people in Gaza. That's what they say about you. Everybody will be a soldier at the end, etc., etc., etc. Everybody pay taxes. The worst thing a country can do, a people can do, is to collectivize the enemy as if it's one subject. It's a horrible thing. There is a place for such an argument, and by the way, I would say there is a majority of Israelis who would accept it.
To accept what?
So this, of course, is necessarily just a moment from that very powerful session. And particularly that idea, which came in at the end of the clip, that one of the real moral pitfalls is to fall into the practice of collectivizing the enemy, as he put it, and treating people when we are doing moral calculus about that include individual rights, to obliterate the individual into a larger collective was an important part of what he was trying to get across. As just a moment from the session, if you want to, as you should, to hear Ms. Ruderin's ideas and exchanges. So again, I'm looking to asking you to listen to the entire session, which is available through the JTS website, as I noted before. And this, of course, applies to all of the sessions that we are, in the end, only able to describe here in this brief seminar, in this brief webinar, in short fragments. The full sessions really are indispensable to a fuller understanding. And we hope that all of this whets your appetite to go to those recordings. And I see that Ellie has put something in the chat here, which will enable you to do that navigation. So another session on the first day squarely looked at the problem of creating unity without running roughshod over a healthy pluralism. Dr. Yizhar Hess, who's the vice chairman of the World Zionist organization and had been the executive director of the Masorti movement for many years, he took part in this session, which was a nice honor for us, along with Dr. Nurit Novus-Deutsch of the University of Haifa. Dr. Elon Schwartz, the founder of Shacharit, whose work is done in what he calls this is his phrase, the deep diversity of Israeli society. These are the kinds of things that a recent president of the state of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, talked about the different tribes, as he put it, in Israeli society. This is the deep diversity. So Elon Schwartz noted that until 1977, there was a pretty consistent, really a consistent hegemony of Israeli leadership by mostly liberal Israelis of European descent. But suddenly, and this was with the election of the first election of Likud and Menachem Begin, many different voices and visions began to be heard and to make their demands in the Israeli public square. They had always been there, but hadn't yet emerged into the public square. And so Elon Schwartz asked, so what do you do when you have conflicting visions of a place? If you feel that they're somehow threatening, are you going to go and treat them like threats? Should they be seen, as some saw them and actually articulated this, as stealing the country? They're stealing our country from us, as Schwartz put it, as if you own the country. And someone who has a different view and comes from a different life experience is doing something inimical. How does one make room for diversity and still draw lines that should not and cannot be crossed? So his experience as a director of Shacharit, which is an organization that deals exactly with this, creating some kind of sense of civic unity in this diversity, his experience taught him, you try to win over the people who disagree with you, try to win them over to your side, win over to you people who are of vastly different backgrounds and experiences, especially those who come from the Arab world or from the former Soviet Union. It is rarely a successful strategy. Instead, he said, there needs to be a conscious and conscientious embrace of people and views that are different, recognizing that it's not easy, that sometimes some suspicion actually is warranted, and that you have to figure out what lines you're not willing to cross. Here, by the way, I mentioned earlier when Chancellor Schwartz talked about her great-grandfather's love of Hebrew, the importance of Hebrew came up here in a crucial way. Why? Because so many of the voices in Israel, of which liberal diaspora Jews tend to be suspicious and sometimes dismissive, are people who do not speak English. And thus Anglophones without Hebrew will not really be able to meet and encounter and dialogue with them. A big issue that he focused us on. Again, I don't have a clip from that one. We don't have enough time for it, but it's well worth listening to. The complexity involved in creating the Jewish state in the first place, a complexity that has not usually been apparent to or really understood so well by diaspora Jews, was taken up again in a session on day 2, when the relationship between religion and democracy in Israel was the focus. It included Rabbi Rick Jacobs, head of the Union of Reform Judaism, Sarah Yael Hirschhorn of the University of Haifa presented, as did Rabbi Ayelet Cohn, my colleague here at JTS, the dean of the JTS Rabbinical School. Once again, accessing the recording to give the fullest appreciation of what was said, but of special note is Rabbi Cohn's pointing to the historical reality that the founders in 1948 were envisioning a diverse democracy along Western lines, even as so many in Israel and those aspiring to come to Israel were in the grip of the trauma of the Shoah. How to make good on the democratic and pluralistic promises in the Declaration of Independence while dealing with the nursing of those pains and fears and suspicions is perhaps not so remarkably still with us today, and of course has only been intensified and stoked by the events of October 7th. There was also a wonderful session on cultural influences emanating from Israel in music and literature and in language. It featured Matthew Lazar and Ruby Namdar and Miriam Meir of our own faculty, and the recording of that session should also not be missed. One more session that I believe should be highlighted here concerned the teaching of Israel and Zionism in the diaspora. Amy Scott Cooper, the National Ramah Director, and her colleague Daniel Olson took part, as did Rabbi Daniel Brenner of Moving Traditions, and Peter Geffen, who is the founder of Kivunim and a longtime Israel educator. Those who are not familiar with Kivunim, you might want to look that up. It's a remarkable program. So I will in a moment play one last clip, which was from Geffen's remarks. But I want to note here as a framing something that the late philosopher Robert Nozick once wrote about human love in general. It wasn't about Israel, but it's about human love. And here's what Nozick wrote. To be englowed by someone's love, it must be we ourselves who are loved, not a whitewashed version of ourselves. It is no reassurance to be loved by someone ignorant of those traits and features we feel might make us unlovable. In the full intimacy of love, the full person is known and cleansed and accepted and healed. And it was in this spirit that Geffen made the all-important point that responsible education requires that in teaching about Israel, we not shield our young students from some of the more problematic aspects of its history, as if those things will never become known, that they're not going to learn about it in college, and that they will never have occasion to feel that their elders and teachers lied to them, because of course, all of those things will happen. So here is that clip from Peter Geffen's talk. It's just a little over a minute.
I am strongly suggesting that building into our educational programs a more positive and accurate story of Jewish life across the last 1,500 years within the Arab world will not only benefit the cultural and ethnic pride of our Jewish students from Arab heritage, it will change the tone of the Jewish people's relationship with the whole Arab world. We must become centers of intellectual openness. Our students should not learn about leveled villages and refugees from a college course on settler colonialism. Whatever there is to tell, the good and the bad, should be material we are willing and able to teach within our own walls. College should not surprise our students with facts we did not tell them. And on the positive side, enriched study of our people's experience within the Arab world will tell a story filled with Jewish Arab culture and moments of elation on the one hand, and yes, sadness on the other, just like our experiences amongst the Christian nations of Europe.
Well, I think that speaks for itself. And again, I think a good whetting of the appetite to hear more. A final session featuring Chancellor Emeritus Arnold Eisen and JTS Professor David Kramer and Rabbi Joanna Samuels, the CEO of the JCC of the West Side. They discussed the takeaways from the entire convening, and in the process also shared some thoughts about whether non-Zionism or even anti-Zionism, at least the kind of anti-Zionism that doesn't wish destruction on the state and its people, can those things be embraced as part of the Jewish world in the diaspora? And that too will reward a close listen. At the center of the convening was the Henry and Selma Rappaport Memorial Lecture delivered by Dr. Elliot Cosgrove, the senior rabbi of the Park Avenue Synagogue. In that lecture, he spoke of some of the history of Zionism at JTS and went on to articulate the kind of American Zionism that he seeks, one in which the extremes wield less power over Jewish public policy, and in which a consensus is built to support Israel while insisting on religious pluralism, on civil rights for all citizens, whatever their ethnic and religious identity, and a robust democracy under a rule of law. In putting down those markers, Cosgrove gave a kind of foreshadowing of the next planned convening. With all that we've learned from this recent, highly successful one, and from the questions that remain open, and in some cases, questions waiting to be asked, we are already planning a second convening on Zionism that will be held at JTS in the first 2 days of April 2025. Whereas the first, as you've heard from me, focused largely on the diaspora and how it has been influenced and challenged by Israel, this second one will largely reverse that, focusing on internal issues in Zionism in Israel. It will likely include discussions of how diaspora institutions can have a greater influence on the constitution of Israeli society, and will thus supply a second reciprocal causal arrow to the partnership between Israel and the diaspora, these two foci, if you will. It will also deal with the pre-October 7th turmoil over judicial reform, and what sort of resolution of that crisis over the rule of law and democracy might be possible. And we plan to address the trauma that has overtaken Israel since October 7th, and that in the process has only added to the still lingering trauma of the Shoah. And there will be much more, all with presenters of the high caliber that we were proud to bring together in October of this year. And we hope that you will be able to be with us for that. And with that, hopefully there maybe will be a couple of questions, but I'm going to end this talk with good wishes to everyone in this month of Hanukkah, and Shalom al Yisrael.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Tucker. I really appreciate it. I wanted to, and there have been some questions just in terms of you synthesized this kind of broad sense of the convening, but I wanted to get into people. Well, were there points of contention? Were there fights? What were the places in which philosophically people were not maybe seen eye to eye? When you're bringing this many wedge issues to bear, what were the challenges that emerged that you saw just in between both, maybe between the presenters, but also if there were things that you felt like the participants were exploring and challenged by?
Well, people, first of all, were very well behaved, including the audience, I'm happy to say. In sessions where we thought that there might be some more contentious questions, we took the precaution of having people write them out on index cards and submit them, but it turned out not to have been really necessary to do that. As you might imagine, in the session, with Moshe Halbertal and Jody Ruderin, because it was dealing with these high voltage issues of, how one uses power, there were, understandably questions not only on the stage itself with our moderator, Professor Shira Billet of our faculty, about whether, to use an American analogy, was our Constitution meant to be a suicide pact? Does the morality of law get to the point of really endangering us? Halbertal had said, a morality of war that doesn't allow you to defend yourself, there's something wrong with the morality, because defending yourself is intrinsically a just thing to do. But he also made it clear that not everything goes in doing that. So there was some. It wasn't so much that people were attacking one another's ideas, but it was clear that the presenters themselves were aware of the different possible rebuttals, or at least challenges to the things that they were saying, and that was in good Talmudic fashion, frankly. In the session,
they were anticipating the conflicting response.
Yeah. In the session on education, I should say also there were. This is a important thing to point out. For two of those sessions, there were breakout sessions for an hour afterwards, where people who were in the audience were able to get into smaller groups and to process and to talk about the things that went on there. I'm not able to tell you a whole lot about those because I wasn't able to attend them all. And in some cases, in one case, I wasn't able to attend any of them because I had to do something else at that moment. But the reports we got back was that there was some very robust exchanges of views there, but nothing got out of hand. It was there was nothing. Everything was in the spirit of really understanding that we are at an important crossroads and we have to get our best thoughts and heads together to try to get better understanding and a better path forward.
This was not something that came up so much, I think, but I think it was something that we were highly concerned with going in. One of our participants once you to comment on the notion of anti-Semitism being equated to anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. And did you have a notion of how this was fitting into the convening at all, or was this something that was kind of just a separate entity that you knew could emerge through the convening?
So it mostly came up in the convening on anti-Semitism that was held last April, right? A lot of focus there was on the different forms and the different, the higher decibels of anti-Semitism today, and even in our own neighborhood here in Morningside Heights, and the fact that anti-Zionism, despite many disclaimers, often does, in the opinion of many, in a reasonable opinion, I think, of many people, veers into anti-Semitism. But the question is, does it necessarily do so? And that did come up really at the very end in that session with Chancellor Emeritus Eisen, and in particular in what was presented and said by Professor David Kramer, who's also the seminary librarian. I deliberately made that distinction between an anti-Zionism that wishes ill to the state and to the people there, which is clearly beyond the pale. And this is unfortunately what some of the anti-Zionists on campuses, they have no plan for the 7.2 million Jews living in Israel, and they don't really much care. As opposed to people who, think that, the Zionist idea was, probably not the best idea, wasn't likely to really succeed, particularly given that part of the world, but do care about the welfare of the people who are there, and understand that whether I thought it was a good idea for there to be a state, there is a state, and it has the same claim on rights and integrity of borders and defense as any other state in the world has. That is a kind of anti-Zionism that David Kramer was really kind of laying out, and we understand that that's not everyone's cup of tea, but it is a provocative idea that is it possible to be a good Jew, to care about Jews, to care about Jewish practice, to engage in Jewish practice, to do all the things that clearly do not reek of anti-Semitism, or even have the aroma of anti-Semitism, but to do it in alongside the sense that Zionism may have been a mistake, right? It's not my point of view. It's not the majority point of view, certainly, of American Jews, and certainly not at that convening. But the question was raised whether this is something that has to be cast aside or dismissed in the Jewish world, or can it be integrated in some way? And I don't think we have a definitive answer to that, but I think it was an important matter to at least raise and have people thinking about as they left the convening, because it was really the last session.
I want to thank you so much for distilling 2 very full days. I think we all came out of this feeling like our heads were incredibly stuffed, and there were so many ideas, but you've taken this down into a remarkable 1-hour presentation. So thank you so much. And I hope that some of you will consider watching some of the full videos. Again, we'll share that link in the chat. Also, just know we're working on producing a podcast with some shorter reflections from some of the speakers on there. And hopefully that'll be launching in January, February. So there's still the opportunity to hear more from these speakers. And I just want to thank you, Rabbi Tucker, for sharing with us next week, everyone. I will note next week our session is at 7:30 Eastern time. 7:30 Eastern. Actually, our next 2 sessions will not be our normal lunchtime. They will be at 7:30 Eastern. And we are delighted to have, and we ended by talking about divides. So it's kind of appropriate that our next session is with Rabbi Jan Urbach, who's going to be talking about working across divides and talking across divides. I know this could have been very helpful before our Thanksgiving meals for those of us who have very divided political families at this moment, but I'm sure that whatever the messaging is will be helpful as we move into the rest of this holiday season. So again, thank you so much, Rabbi Tucker, and thank you all for joining us.
And I so appreciate your presence with us here today. Thank you for joining.